The Kerouac Project Spring 2023 resident, Joy Balio, is a mammal who is an extraordinary storyteller. Her speculative literary fiction is both clever and, more importantly, deeply moving. In her flash fiction, Box of Ghosts, published in the Bureau Dispatch, a young narrator is given a box of ghosts, a random inheritance of miniature mystery that becomes a burden with the imaginative strain of adulthood. That one hit me hard. In her short story, They Could Have Been Yours, published in the Missouri Review, a successful young lawyer gives in to envy and jealousy when her social media feed explodes with notices of all her exes getting engaged. A magic ring allows her to get unreasonably close to her ex's fiancés. In the flash fiction, Belly of the Beast, published in American Short Fiction, a wife discovers a change in her marriage when her husband is transformed, or perhaps just devoured, by a wolf who moves into her house.
Hey, y'all. Hey there.
Excuse us.
Watch this space. Okay. Joy Balio's work has received fellowships from the Corporation of Yaddo, the Vermont Studio Center, the Elizabeth George, all right, now I'm failing at eye technology. The Elizabeth George Foundation, the Speculative Literature Foundation, Bread Loaf Writers Conference, and Martha's Vineyard Institute of Creative Writing. Her writing has been recognized by numerous contests and awards, including the Plowshares Emerging Writers Contest, honorable mention, and the Wigleaf Top 50 Very Short Fictions. She holds an MFA from the New School and currently serves as Associate Fiction Editor at Bucknell University's literary magazine, West Branch. She teaches at Grub Street in Boston and at Pioneer Valley Writers Workshop in Western Massachusetts, which she founded in 2016. Tonight, Joy will be reading from a short story she's worked on during a residency here at the Kerouac Project of Orlando. She'll read for about 20 minutes, and then we'll shift to an informal Q&A away from the podium during the socializing part of the night and whatnot. Please help me welcome Joy Balio.
Wow, thank you so much, John, and thank you, Eric, and thank you everyone for coming. So wonderful to see such a full house. And I was just saying, it's such a surreal experience to feel like this is your personal little living room, and then see it transformed into what feels like an event space. So that is just one of the rare treats of this residency. Before I read, I just want to say a couple things about my experience here, which has been absolutely phenomenal. And just a huge thank you to everyone who makes this residency possible. This has been kind of a life-changing residency. For one, I got to bring my fiance, Eric, who is also a huge part of my process with writing, and we talk about revision all the time. I'm constantly running stuff by him. He's also a phenomenal editor and a writer. So that's amazing to have that part of the process be able to come here also. Hi. Also amazing is the location, which I didn't really expect to matter so much to my novel, which was the primary thing I worked on. So I'm working on this novel that is based on a short story of mine. If anyone is curious about what it is, I'm not going to read from it because it's so messy, and it's so in the first draft stage, and there's always a little bit of fear I have about sharing that in that stage of work, because it's very impressionable, and it's changing, and it doesn't feel like a thing that I share with. I don't share it with anyone. I don't even share it with Eric. So I'm not going to read from that. But it is based on a short story of mine that was in the New Ohio Review, which is about two sisters that are half mermaid sisters growing up after their mermaid mother leaves to go back to the ocean, kind of called back there. And I've been searching for a while about where to set this. Where does it feel like the right place for this? It needs to kind of be the place is so important to it. And it was set in Portland at one point. It was set in Maine at one point. And when I came here, I was just sitting on the porch where I did most of my writing, and I'm like the Florida air, the rain, and then I started learning about the spring system and the sinkholes and the aquifer under Florida. And it just started to feel like, wow, Central Florida is really speaking to this project. So it's called How to Survive on Land. If and when you see that coming out, Central Florida will be represented. So that's a fun aspect of, I think, how this residency wove its way into that. And then I ended up doing, Eric and I did a lot of research trips to different places, and I was, it's really hard to not have place influence writing. I find there's such an relationship there. So that felt really, really wonderful. And last thing before I start reading, I just want to say thanks to everyone, to the community, the people who came to the write-in, all the people who we met while sitting on the porch here, which a lot of you, the people we met at Word Lab, in the class I taught at the Winter Park Library, just through social media. I did not expect Orlando to feel like, nothing against Orlando, I just wasn't expecting it to feel like such a vibrant community, like we could just live here, So that's kind of how it is feeling. So I wanted to just, share that, how magical it's been. The last thing I will say before I read, I'm going to read from a short story that I have been working on for a long time, but I did a lot of work on it here, and I did sort of final revisions on it here. So it felt, and I work on short fiction and novels. I work, not novels, but I work on short fiction and the novel kind of back and forth. My process is about shifting which one I'm really feeling that day, and they kind of all advance together. So I consider myself a fabulist, someone who is interested in myth, fairy tales. Oh, come in. Are you trying to come to the reading?
I'll go around the other side.
Oh, Jeff, hi. This is going to be really interesting footage of the reading filmed. You have the speaker here and the door right there, and people coming in. So I write a lot. I draw from myth, from fairy tale. People like Oscar Wilde, Hans Christian Andersen were sort of my first favorite writers as a child, and that really stayed with me throughout. So there's a lot of that influence in my work. There's a lot of speculative elements, influences of magic, shape-shifting. But as the story calls for it. So some of my stories are more realistic and don't really call for that element in the same way. So let me go to my piece here. All right, so the story is called Frog Heart. There was once a young couple whose daughter was born with a weak heart, and when she was 3 months old, her heart began to fail. It did not happen immediately, but toward evening, as she lay still in her crib, her parents began to notice all the dreaded signs the doctors had predicted. Labored breathing, swelling, an unusual sleepiness that had descended and persisted since afternoon. The condition was untreatable in someone so young, and the doctors had told them only months earlier that they should begin to plan for the worst. But when the husband rushed to the phone and his wife could hear him begging for an ambulance to be sent, she lifted the baby out of the crib and into her arms, thinking angrily of the doctor's words, and slipped out the back door. Perfect timing. Welcome. Except she's coming in instead of out of the door here. It was a moonless June night, dark and humid, a thick white mist over the grass, and the bullfrogs were chanting in the pond across the field. The woman walked quickly through the unmown weeds, her feet sinking into the marsh grass with each step. She went toward the water, carrying her daughter's body, limp like a doll but still breathing, and when she came to the ragged line of cattails that guarded the water's edge, she stopped and said in a very small voice, King Frog, I'm here. I need your help." It should be known that certain stories had been whispered in this town for as long as the woman could remember. Rumors and legends, but whispered with a certain respect in people's voices all the same. Because who wants to stand in the way of the mysteries of the world? Mostly, though, People whispered warnings. Beware the frog king who lives under the river and visits the ponds of this valley. He will take your children. He will pull them under, breathe new life into them. She had never known what to make of the stories, yet she had not forgotten the last part of this warning. And with nothing to lose, something in her had moved with animal need out into the night. Now, alone at the edge of the pond, her baby daughter lying still in her arms, she felt both hopeless and silly. And she hugged her baby to her more tightly and said again, in a louder voice, King Frog, I'm here. Please, if you can hear me, help me. I beg you. All at once the raucousing frogs fell silent, and not a single cricket chirped in the field. Even the wind seemed to pause at her words, and despite the moonless dark and the night, the woman saw a black ripple spread across the surface of the pond, heard the squelching of mud, then the soft shush, shush, shush of something sliding over wet reeds, and her pulse quickened as she was certain that a very large creature had crawled out of the dark water and was now moving through the grass toward her. She smelled the stagnant, fishy tang of the marsh, so strong she could taste it on her tongue. And then, there, a few feet from her, the hulking silhouette of the largest frog she'd ever seen, the size of a small truck, its skin covered in roiling scabs, warts and other growths that seemed almost alive with oozing. Yellow eyes, round and wet, stared down at her, and a wide mouth opened, ready to speak. Yes, human woman, what do you want? Its voice was deep and mud-choked, and it reminded her of the sunless depths of a pond. The woman squeezed her baby, then laid her on the ground in front of the frog, aware even as she did this of the potential violence she was committing. My daughter, she said, her heart is failing. Is there anything you can do? The king frog looked down at the girl, and the mother held her breath. It seemed to her that the silence lasted whole minutes, and that everything around her, grass and reeds and pond and fish, all held their breath too. And in that suspended moment, she imagined such horrible actions from the giant frog that she had to restrain herself from grabbing her girl up again. It's true that she does not have long, the giant frog said. If you choose, I will give her a new heart. But you must agree to teach her who she is and what she is. She will never be fully yours, never fully human. You must agree to this. Agree? The mother said. Yes, of course I agree. If it will save her, give her whatever you must. The monstrous frog made a sound, low and rumbling. Then he picked up the baby in his black pit of mouth and swallowed her. The mother's breath caught in her throat, but she held herself still and silent, watching, and it felt to her as if that instant held all the possibilities of her daughter's life in the world. Something was churning inside the frog king, rumbling and gurgling, and all around them a humming had begun. The frogs in the pond had resumed their chanting, an ominous one-note drone growing louder and louder and more varied until the sound pulsed with the wild, frantic rhythms of an underworld night of revelry. The mother did not take her eyes from the frog king, but in the periphery of her vision, she could see and feel all manner of crawling, creeping creatures moving in the fields and puddles beyond. And finally, when the mother felt faint with disgust, sure that the monster had killed her daughter for good, the frog king began to roar, lifted his head toward the sky, and hurled up the baby along with the fetid gunk of his insides. She was crying, but alive, moving, breathing with new energy, and the mother snatched her up. I have given her a frog heart, he said. It will serve her well. Now, do not forget what you have promised. and he turned away and slumped back into the dark pond. The woman stood for a long moment by the water's edge, holding her child, eyes wide and staring into the night, not understanding what she had witnessed, which was such a startling mix of horror and miracle that the world, bounded and logical and expected as she'd always thought of it, seemed suddenly to contain multitudes and mysteries beyond her scope. Yet she felt primarily the warm blanket of her own relief, a gratitude that seemed bigger than any mystery the world might hold or hide. She walked across the field, which, although just as dark, seemed lit from the marshy earth itself, her daughter laughing and making small sounds in her arms, alive and well. Let us talk briefly of promises. Perhaps you are the kind of person who reminds yourself daily of yours, guarding it with the respect that most promises deserve. Or perhaps you have broken one, or two, or many. Perhaps circumstances changed, and the very soil in which the promise was planted has now been tilled and sown with something else. And you wonder if you are even still held by it, if it will grow in that soil at all. Though perhaps you are the kind of person who has no regard at all for a promise, takes each moment as it comes, a new promise made to replace the old. Perhaps, as most of us are, you are not even aware you are making a promise at all. The woman, you must know, intended in that moment by the pond to keep her promise, although she was, of course, not thinking of what that would mean. In her daughter's early years, she thought about what happened that night with the kind of reverence of someone who has been permitted to see beyond a locked door into some other secret room. She would leave small gifts for the frogs by the edge of the pond, worms, colorful leaves, rocks stippled with fossils of ancient bugs. She put stickers of frogs on the walls of her daughter's room, which she also painted a moss green, and in the summer cracked the windows open at bedtime so they could both hear the night music of the pond. She'd carry her daughter through the fields of marsh grass, pointing excitedly at the small frogs that hopped out of their way, whispering in her ear, "You are very special, and because of the gift of another, you are here." Yet over the years, as her daughter grew, the woman began to forget her promise to the Frog King. This did not happen all at once or intentionally, but in the way that memories form and fade over time, selectively lighting parts of themselves, casting other parts in shadow, until the thing remembered is a new thing completely. And when her daughter was no longer a baby, but a small child, after her husband had started a new job that kept him away for days at a time, the mother began to think that perhaps she had imagined or dreamed the events of that mist-filled night by the pond. Perhaps in her terror, her grief, her hope, she had conjured the Frog King from a desperate part of herself, and perhaps her daughter's heart was as human as her own. It was true that certain small quirks emerged in the girl as she grew, took the mother by surprise. There were the flies snatched from the windowsill with an unnatural speed. It's okay. There were the flies snatched from the windowsill with an unnatural speed of hand when her daughter was a toddler, then gulped quickly, sneakily when the girl thought her mother was not looking. There was her constant shivering, a deep internal coldness all winter into the spring, despite the thick sweaters her mother heaped over her. Yet in the heat of summer, the mother observed her daughter, now 4, pulling still wet shirts off the part of the clothesline that sagged low to the ground and wrapping herself in them, cold and clinging until they dried, as if craving the cool dampness of swamp on her skin. There was the way her daughter would sit, still and staring for whole minutes at a single point, a bird perched on a clothesline, an animal in the yard, in what seemed to the mother a trance of reptilian focus. This sudden trance happened in conversation, too. Her daughter would be talking, giggling, then as if some other being had awakened inside her, the girl's face took on a stony stillness. Her eyes would brighten, glazed and unblinking, and threaded throughout these moments, the mother detected a quiet sadness, a feeling that should not be part of any childhood, that she feared was some remnant of that night, some unwanted gift of the Frog King. But there was one encounter with her daughter when the girl was just 5 that bothered her more than the others, a splinter of unease that pressed itself deeper into her mind each day and made her realize with increasing dread the truth of that night. She had found her daughter sitting in the sun outside the house, crouched low to the ground, a look of concentration on her face. "What are you doing?" she asked the girl, who responded without turning her head or even blinking. "Trying to feel the lump of ice in my chest." These words sent a shiver through the mother, a sense of knowing. That night had not been in her mind alone, and the thought flashed quickly in her that perhaps the heart had been more than a gift. Perhaps some cold, wet sliminess had passed with it into her daughter's soul, the price or curse for accepting such an offering. But she held this in, hugged her daughter to her, and said blithely, with a forced nonchalance that belied her own worries, "That's just your heart, my darling. We all have one. It's what keeps us alive, and yours is special." And this is all she ever revealed to her daughter about the frog heart that beat in her chest. I'm just going to skip ahead. I want to read just one other paragraph so you can kind of see how things change.
You're not going to finish it?
No, it's long. This is a full-length short story, not flash. So, but just to give you a taste of how she changes, and and like sort of what I think of as the heart of the story. What should I tell you of Frogheart's approach to womanhood? A lot of other stuff has happened before this. The fact that she was angry and rebellious, would dive to the turbid mud at the bottom of the pond or larger nearby lake or even the swift-flowing river and watch with eyes open, still and silent as a bottom-dwelling beast, pretending to be a submerged corpse, she'd say, or the time a cargo train slid off the rails along the river at night, smoothly and silently as an eel slipping back into its element. And the crew of 3 were brought to the surface quickly and propulsively by a diver of inhuman strength and speed, the papers said. Yet of course the mother knew. Or what of the unsmiling, scrawny boys Frogheart snuck home and up to her room? Older boys who smelled like the back room of a bar, with neck tattoos and long hair, whose gruff voices the mother heard at night in whispered laughter with her daughters. Once she heard one of them, louder than the others, as they came up the stairs to her daughter's room. "So you're like not fully human, right?" "Something like that," Frogheart said. "A monster, obviously." Snickering laughter, then, "I dig it." Then the door to her room closed. The mother lay in bed, seething and confused, unsure of where or how to intervene. She did not want to humiliate her daughter, did not want a violent confrontation, and yet she felt secretly at war, a battle for the soul of her girl, yet she could not win her back only through discipline, which she knew would push her away even more. And yet the mother's anger did not go away, but dripped into some inner reservoir that became heavier and heavier. She hated the voices at night in her daughter's room, hated the newspaper clippings of her daughter's swimming feats and river rescues. Her daughter, always wet-haired and wide-eyed, newly emerged from some dark pool. She hated also the sound of the frogs in the pond. I'll stop there. Yeah, it's long, but thank you for listening.